All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Antero. I'm here talking with Kathryn about Dialect, which is currently on Kickstarter. Kathryn, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself and what we're doing, what we're talking about today?
Absolutely. Hi there. I am Kathryn Hymes. I am one half of an indie game studio out of San Francisco called Thorny Games, and we specialize in making games about language and cryptography. Uh, Niche market, you might say, but it's one that we're pretty passionate about. My background is in math and language, so I went to graduate school for like applied math, and then got a job as a computational linguist. But over time, that passion kind of morphed into something different, and now game design takes up a lot of my spare cycles.
So I think one of your most recent game, or at least the most recent game the public's looking at, is Dialect, which is currently doing gangbusters on Kickstarter. I think I'm looking at it right now. Can you talk a little bit about? So this seems like it falls right into this broad area of role-playing games and language. Can you talk about what Dialect is and maybe why you think it's doing so well?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I'm happy to see also that it's doing well. Yeah, so Dialect is a tabletop role-playing game about an isolated community and their language and what it means for that language to be lost. So it's about language death. Tabletop role-playing is a form of game where people end up collaboratively telling a story together. So given rules, like the right amount of prompts and constraints, a bunch of people at a table, though it doesn't have to be live, it can be over the internet, get together and end up like using sort of their creative juices combined with like the format of the game, and then are able to take part in a journey of a story. And Dialect in particular is a story about a community that players will define themselves given the prompts. So you'll do some amount of world building. For example, we have a setting that works in like a Martian outpost. So you can imagine that you're a community like the first like settlement on Mars in 5 minutes in the future, kind of thing. Or maybe you're a community that's built a compound somewhere, and then you explore kind of what are the defining characteristics of that community and see how those are reflected in the language of the community. So you end up telling a story of that community over time, but really looking at the way that that language morphs. But ultimately, like the game is about language death, which is a very real phenomenon that is like near and dear to my heart in the sense that I really believe in like language rejuvenation and revitalization efforts. And so I thought that this was a particularly interesting medium where people could kind of experience a small taste of what that could mean in story form.
Interesting. So I guess I'm curious, maybe we can unpack for a minute, other than it sounds interesting, right? Like why is language death something that people should be aware of and thinking about, particularly in an era right now, we've got a very contentious election. We're in a post-Brexit society. I'm trying to think of like all these global contexts. What is it about language death that's probably important to us right now?
Yeah, that is a very good question. I would say that language is just a fundamental part of identity and what it means to be human. And I think that sometimes it's easy to be unaware just how much of a culture and a people and even your personhood is just tied up in the way that we speak. And it is just a very real and human form of being. That's something that when it's lost, you've really lost a shade of humanity. And with globalization today, like the world is becoming more and more the same. Like English is spreading, other dominant languages are spreading, and there is an acceleration of languages that are smaller and maybe less powerful or privileged that kind of get eaten up in the madness. But there are real human stories there, and but more than just human stories, it's like things that are true about perspectives on the world, and also just true about like the way that the human brain has codified itself in language that we lose when those languages are lost.
So it seems like there's thinking about the phase of this game where you start by, as players, it sounds like you start by creating a culture and its language and see how it grows. And then at the end, you also see how this language dies. Are those two phases, the creation of new languages and the death of existing languages? Are those things happening? I'm asking devil's advocate-y questions now.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Are those things that are happening in society today?
Yes. Well, language is evolving all of the time. Like, even if you are just like, like roundabout person on the internet, you can see just how much like new language items, words, but even just like ways of speaking are happening and changing on various corners around the web. That's one way that's an easy way to track because it has like a very clear trace. But languages are also being born. And there are amazing stories about language birth in modern times. Nicaraguan Sign Language is one such example, but there are many others. And dialects and just the way that the people are, present themselves and their group, whatever group they may belong to through language, is just a natural consequence of humans being together. So yeah, and then language death is absolutely something that happens as well. You can see, and actually, it's very interesting with tech that when like there's a dominance of certain languages on the web because of the privilege that certain cultures have in actually getting access to technology. And that has a ricochet effect down the line of how much representation they have, how good technology is in dealing with those kinds of languages, and so on and so forth.
I realize we've moved a little bit beyond the game. We'll come back, I promise, in a second.
Yeah.
Are these things we should worry about? So I think about, grandparents who might fret about emoji and what the erosion of standard English, right? If I think as a former English teacher, right, these are things that I hear other teachers often worrying about too. Are these things we should be worried about with language?
No, not at all. I think that like I'm a total non-prescriptivist when it comes to that. Like, language is beautiful as it naturally comes, and it will evolve. I think that when there are outside forces, though, that end up keeping certain languages down based on sort of the existing power structures of the day, and that make us lose whole languages. That those are things that we can help try and counteract. But it definitely is not a suggestion that we try and like keep some mode of stasis in language and that it should all be the same. Languages are beautiful and evolve.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah. So thinking about that and coming back to dialect, as I think about oftentimes working with teachers and working with students, is this a game that could be adapted to work in classroom or in school settings? Is this a game that's for adults over drinks? Is it what's our audience here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that actually the audience can be pretty wide, because if you're interested in telling human stories that take an interesting look at language, then this is a game for you. And absolutely, that can take place in the classroom. And depending on who you are and who your friends are, that could totally take place at the bar. Certainly with my friends, but yeah, in the classroom, I think that this is a really interesting look at sociolinguistics and also just language evolution, like how languages is particular to a set of people, and what that can mean, and then also just pointing out the very real human stories around how languages die, which is through assimilation, right? And there can be like good and bad that comes with assimilation too, right? That's a complicated subject. Lots of economic incentives for people to, change the language that is most dominant to them to whatever is the domineering language, but also just destruction, natural disaster, so on and so forth.
So, and I think thinking about that and thinking about these stories and how they're tied to issues of power, which just seems like such a powerful place for students in particular to be thinking about languages. You mentioned Nicaraguan Sign Language, and I know this is a project that is also another text you can get as part of this Kickstarter, the game Sign. Do you want to talk a little bit about Sign?
Sure. Yeah. So Sign is a live action game that is based off the amazing story of the Nicaraguan Sign Language, which is a language born in modern times from the hands of children. If you don't know this story, you should absolutely go and track down this story. But in brief, it is that there was no predominant sign language existing in Nicaragua through the 1970s. There was an initiative to kind of gather deaf children from across the country into schools and to try and teach them Spanish through lip reading. That failed, but instead what happened is that these children were around their like true peers, people who could like really empathize with their worldview for the first time. And humans do what humans do. They tried to communicate, and through trying to communicate, they ended up negotiating the beginnings of a language that then evolved kind of from grade to grade to grade to become something that was complex and beautiful and just a mature form of communication that is today the national sign language of Nicaragua. So we have a game that walks people through the very like basic steps of what an experience like this might be like, meaning like with the hope of one, spreading this incredible story, but also giving people some amount of empathy for just how powerful it is to be understood and how that spark is something that exists in all of us.
I love that. I think what I really appreciate about at least both of these games and learning about them is, so I've spent the past 2 years studying tabletop role-playing games and playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, since that's what's pretty prevalent up in the community that I'm in right now. And as a result, anytime language comes into play there, it's basically a barrier. If you don't speak Dwarven, for example, you don't get the information that's in this book, right? And it's and I think it seems like what Thorny Games is doing is really broadening, you know, these notions of what languages can mean and what they can do, and it's not just this binary yes or no, which I think I appreciate and I'm excited about.
Yeah, I feel you when it comes to like all the skills that you have to declare in D&D, whether or not you can speak Dwarven or Elvish or all this stuff. I think that with Thorny Games, we're trying to explore like complex ideas in language, but also just like the fun of storytelling at the same time. And I think that when you blend two awesome things together, it becomes all the better.
Awesome. So, okay, so I'll ask one more devil's advocate question and we'll wrap up here. But so this is a tabletop game, which essentially I'm guessing it'll largely be a book, right? And maybe some artifacts that come with it. But why not a video game? As I think this, I imagine, particularly as people who are thinking about learning and digital media, this is probably a question people think a lot around role-playing games: is why isn't this a video game?
Yeah, that is a good question, and I think that there's some more practical answers to it, but there's also just a passion one that I have. I think the practical answer is that video games are much more difficult to make from indie game studios of like a small number of people and require a huge amount of just upfront investment that brings out different incentives, right? Because you need to create a certain level of success in order for that to succeed. But also, like, there's something pretty magical, I'd say, about humans together making a story and coming together over a table that I think people are really hungry for, and that you can see through like this golden age wave of tabletop games that we're in right now that I think that Dialect is a part of. But that is not to say that at some point we won't explore language through video games. I think stay tuned is the answer.
Done. I think on that note, I will point folks to the Dialect Kickstarter page. There's some really interesting rewards you can get throughout it, including the game itself and Sign, which you mentioned. And so I just want to say thank you. Are there any other things you want to share with us before we, I say the proverbial we, but it's just me.
I think that I would just like to share that that if anyone if you're new to tabletop role playing or indie story games, like there is a huge wide variety of games that are out there that cover really interesting and complex topics. There is like your stalwart D&D, which is wonderful, but there are things that explore like World War II history, like the perspective of women in World War II. It just goes on and on. Community building, like the bones of a story. And so I would, encourage educators and anyone interested in this to just take a look at this kind of beautiful and diverse art form.
I love that. And I'll put some links to a couple of the games I think you're hinting towards
awesome.
in my blog post with this. So Kathryn, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I'm excited about seeing this game when it gets released soon.
Thank you. Me too. Great talking with you.
Thanks.